Thank you very much. My job in this panel is probably a little easier than the jobs others have, because it's basically to discuss the policy choices that the next person in the White House, it could be Obama or the governor, will face in terms of dealing with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. The way I like to think of it is, I think in whatever the outcome of the election, there's going to be a new Secretary of State, I believe. And how would a professional foreign policy official brief that new secretary before he or she had a first substantive meeting with Saudi leaders? What would be the issues that briefer would want to put on the table and say, hey, here are the things you got to discuss, here are the questions that should be on the agenda? And I think any good briefer would go back and say, well, what have been the previous interactions between American presidents and the Saudi leadership? And you would start really with the meeting between then Crown Prince Abdullah and George W. Bush in Texas in 2005, when the Crown Prince suggested and the President agreed that they would form a strategic dialogue committee. And one of the reasons for wanting to have a strategic dialogue committee headed by the foreign minister and the Secretary of State was, prior to that, there were an awful lot of issues coming from all different parts of the government complaining about this kind of Saudi behavior or this, and there was no overall way to put things in context. What was the context of religious freedom, human rights, democratic values versus cooperation on peace process, oil markets, and other things. And one of the things that the strategic dialogue did was put everything on a table for a once every 6-month review by the top leadership. Back in 2005, the main issues that were on the agenda were counter-terrorism, how do you go against terrorists themselves, terror finance, how do you clamp down on loose money going to, wittingly or unwittingly, to terror groups, the issue of visas for Saudis, Saudi Arabia's desire to finally join the World Trade Organization, peace process, and oil prices and Saudi plans for expanding capacity. That was in 2005. I think you can say, if you look back, pretty much ticked the box on counterterrorism. You've got a very well-admired counter-terror operations in Saudi Arabia, where they've both on the educating the public and tracking down people, identifying them, tracking them down, prosecuting them, and then often trying to rehabilitate them. I don't know of any American official who thinks they're severely lacking in that. There's been a great deal of praise on how far they've gone. It took a little longer for the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to work together on terror finance. But a year ago, the Treasury held a sort of a September review of where things stood on cooperation with Saudi Arabia on those two issues. And you had the fellows Stuart Levy and Fran Townsend from the previous administration and the current ones. And during that symposium, what I was struck with was the unanimity with which all those officials felt there had been very substantial progress, and that basically these boxes of counterterrorism, terror finance had been ticked off, and they need continued attention. But those are no longer issues you would put on the next secretary's agenda. They're done. You can tick the box off. The visa issue, which was very contentious in 2005, is pretty much done. Between 2000 and 2005, you had an average of about 3,000 Saudi students studying here in the United States. And, of course, after 9/11, there was an awful lot of scrutiny of the visas. People were held up. Students would often miss a year because their visas would expire, and then they'd have to go back and wait in line. Now you have 60,000 Saudi students here. The visa problem's been solved. They get 5-year visas, and Americans get 5-year multiple entry visas to Saudi Arabia. And I think it's worked very well. I think the fact that the King Abdullah has provided scholarships for those 60,000 Saudi students is an example of where he wants to bring the country. He wants 60,000 people to come back with a good view of American values. And I would point out parenthetically that among those 60,000, there's a disproportionately high representation of Saudi Shia. Saudi ID cards don't identify whether you're Sunni or Shia, but as people look and try to figure who's who, yeah, it's considerably, perhaps double the percentage of Shia in Saudi Arabia are getting scholarships here. I think that's good. Again, in 2005, the big question was oil prices and what the Saudi plans for expanding capacity were. Oil Minister Naimi was there, Cheney was there, and basically they described this program that they were then launching to expand production capacity by 2.5 million barrels a day. And that's done. We still have considerably higher oil prices now than we did in 2005. They've been accelerating. But that's, I think, largely a result of growing world demand outside of the OECD. And unless there's some change in that, we're going to have continued fairly robust pricing. Now, if you're briefing the new secretary, you could go over what are the boxes that have been ticked and successfully done, but what are the new issues that would face? And obviously, one of them, an issue that is worth discussing because he can take actionable action together between our country and Saudi Arabia, is the fallout from the Arab Spring, particularly in Egypt and Yemen. I think we know that Saudi Arabia had mixed feelings about how quickly Mubarak was dumped, but they also, the Saudis played a very crucial role in easing Ali Abdullah Saleh out of Yemen. It wasn't easy, it was slow, it was bloody, but compared to some of the other changes, it wasn't that bad. In April of 2011, just as the Arab Spring was in its full bloom, if you will, the G7 finance ministers met in Deauville, France, and formed something called the Deauville Partnership. Their vision was very simple, that Europe had been through this kind of thing before. After Eastern Europe broke away from the yoke of the Warsaw Pact, you had a whole bunch of newly independent countries struggling with democracy, but also with economy. How do you go from a controlled communist economy to a free economy and make it work? And what Europe had done basically was establish the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was modeled on what the World Bank did to help Western Europe and Japan after World War II. And the EBRD basically provided capital funds plus the things we've all learned about how to do things right rather than wrong in building a new economy. What laws do you need? What structural reforms do you need? What's the best place to put money, not just throwing it down black holes? At the Deauville Partnership, it's again the G7 finance ministers, which is the G8 minus Russia, and then they included in their meeting the Saudi finance minister, the Qatari finance minister, and the Turkish finance minister. So the Deauville Partnership on the donor giving advice side was the G7 plus those three countries. And then on the potential recipient side was Egypt, later Libya in terms not of money, but can we help you in planning and economic revival. Just last month, Yemen's on the list, Tunisia, of course, and tangentially, Morocco and Jordan. They hadn't gone through a transition period, but they also needed economic assistance. Both Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been quite proactive in extending aid to Egypt, both before and after Mohamed Morsi was elected. And I think it's important to understand what sort of aid. Some of the things Egypt needed right away was an ability to sell government bonds and treasury bills, because it's currently paying about 14% interest, which is pretty high for a government. And in the immediate depths of this summer, when things looked terrible, both the Saudis and Qataris came in and said, okay, we'll buy your 1 month's issue of T-bills. Obviously, you get pretty good security of repayment unless the government defaults on everything. But that has helped relieve some of the interest pressure and try to move Egypt out of the debt trap it's in. It's in a worse debt trap than Greece or Italy or Spain. The second thing that both the Saudis and Qataris done, they have, like the World Bank, there's the Islamic Development Bank, various quite good development banks that help identify investment projects, make sure they're built without corruption and that they become effective. I think it's $4.5 billion that Qatar and Saudi Arabia have extended to Egypt. And that has helped now the IMF. Christine Lagarde was out there in September, and they're working on a loan program, very easy terms, very low interest rate and forgiveness. There would be another $4.5 billion or so for Egypt. If those things are combined, then Egypt has a fighting chance to get an economy back on its feet. If you have an economy back on its feet, then it's a little easier to talk about equitable division of resources. If the resource base is going down the tube, you're in a pretty desperate situation. And again, they're starting to talk about doing this with Yemen too, which is, of course, an area the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have cooperated on a lot on counter-terrorism, on the GCC initiative to get the transition in power. But now really the thing is, how do you get this desperately poor country running out of everything all at once? Give it a chance to get back on its feet. At least they're working together on that. The big issues that you want to brief the next secretary on are, of course, Iran, sanctions, and Syria. The imposition of the current set of sanctions by the U.S. and the EU would not have been possible without pre-agreement with Saudi Arabia last November. That if those sanctions led to Iran's losing up to, or a little more than half of its oil exports, would Saudi Arabia be willing to step in and make up those exports so the price wouldn't go through the roof? They agreed. And I think with the caveat that we probably can't make up, Saudis can't make up all of Iran's exports, where there'd be some mechanism to totally shut them down, because that would take Saudi production right up to there and leave no spare capacity, which tends to be a driver for higher oil prices. So as the sanctions have come about, we had some bumpiness in the oil market, particularly in the spring in anticipation. But as they've been implemented, I think we've had at least a stabilization of oil prices at somewhat lower rates than we're expecting. And we're going to see whether these sanctions have an influence on Iranian decision-making. To me, the bottom line is, is Iran really willing to seriously talk about giving up its nuclear weapons program? If they are, I don't see there's a big problem in resolving the whole issue. If they want to prevaricate and have a situation where it's sort of talking about their nuclear weapons program, then the sanctions are probably going to remain for some time, or at least until some other situation arises. I don't think the next administration is going to have a terribly difficult time with Saudi Arabia one way or the other. If diplomacy works, that's fine. They have full diplomatic relations and fully correct relations with Iran. If it produces an end to the Iranian nuclear weapons program. If not, there are different views in Saudi Arabia, and some feel very supportive of a military strike, and others are a little more fearful of it. On Syria, we're in a state of limbo where the Saudis and Qataris have been providing more arms to the Syrian opposition, and I think it's been widely reported that the U.S. has said, please hold off in providing the very effective shoulder-fired missiles that can hit airplanes and tanks. And we're still sort of in limbo with that. I think there's some of those more sophisticated weapons near the borders of Syria, but they're not getting to the opposition in Syria. That's been a point that I think President Romney has made, that he would be in favor of working with the Saudis and Qataris to ensure that the Syrian opposition gets the weapons it needs to hit Assad's planes and tanks. And as far as I know, this is still tied up in the Principals Committee in terms of what actions we should or should not take, and with arguments being, on the one hand, we don't want these arms to go to people we don't know, dangerous people, and the other being, if you leave Assad in place and he prevails, what kind of world is that? So those, I think, would be the big issues on the agenda. Middle East peace process. If there's something actionable that can be done, Saudis be very supportive. I think at the moment they want to get on with the rest of their lives, as long as they can see that this is a riddle that is not going to be solved anytime soon. The final issue would be always on agenda would be oil market stability, and that's been an issue between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia since FDR first met Ibn Saud in 1945. The U.S. didn't import any oil. We were an oil exporter at the time. But for FDR and the 12 presidents that followed him, it's been a very simple formulation. If you understand the size and importance of Saudi oil reserves, whether the U.S. needs to import oil or not, you don't want those oil reserves to fall into the hands or under the indirect control of hostile elements, whether that's the Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein, or currently the Ayatollahs. The world would be very different if hostile powers held the oil resources of the Gulf. They would be able to control the world economy. And that's something that, again, the past 13 presidents have not wanted to contemplate. And so that's sort of be the perennial issue on the table, and it tends to guide the rest of the relationship. Thank you.